I'm Walter Isaacson of the Aspen Institute, and I'm here with Lynne Cheney, author of James Madison, A Life Reconsidered. And now we're going to talk about the personal aspects of James Madison. Tell me about his background. He's from a Virginia planter family, right?
He is, and I think we have a more exalted view of that than the reality. They lived modestly. They had slaves. They lived better than most people in Orange County, Virginia. But it was not grand by any means. Jefferson's life, Washington's life, both of those are much grander.
Madison also had a certain reticence, and he dressed very plainly. He was unadorned in his speech. Where did that come from? Was that a character trait?
I think character traits are usually emphasized by learning, and he read The Spectator as a boy, wonderful collection of essays that emphasize the importance of modesty and that also emphasize the political uses of modesty. We don't think of it that way too much anymore, but Madison instantly understood that you don't want to stand up and make pronouncements before the situation is completely unfolded. Many a politician today stumbles over that still. And he understood that it was the ideas that were important rather than the credit. We hear people say it's not important who gets the credit, it's important what gets done, but Madison really reflected that.
Franklin read The Spectator as well, the essays by Addison and Steele, and he said of the humility and reticence, he said, I was never very good at the virtue of humility, but I was good at the pretense of it, and I knew how useful it was to have the pretense of humility. So that's what Addison and Steele have, this sort of humorous quality in The Spectator, and it was fun that both Madison and Franklin read it. You also say he had a real focus and an obsessive effort in what he did. I mean, he was not sort of happy-go-lucky.
The Virginians had a reputation for indolence that neither Jefferson nor Madison betrayed at all, Madison especially. He worked all the time, and he worked at learning, and once his interest became building government, that's what he studied. When Jefferson was in Paris, he asked him to send books on the subject, show me how constitutions have worked in other times. There's a book that came out recently called The Outlier that emphasizes how much you have to practice to become a champion. And Madison, I think, practiced more than any of the founders at becoming a great leader.
One of the things I learned from your book that was absolutely fascinating, and you treat it very, very sensitively, was his worry about his epilepsy. Tell me about that.
He wrote in an unfinished manuscript at the end of his political career that he had suffered throughout his life with sudden attacks, somewhat resembling epilepsy, and suspending the intellectual functions. I've talked to neurologists, and it seems likely he suffered from a mild form of epilepsy. Today we call it complex partial seizures, in which you just sort of depart for a while and then come back. He had probably his first attack as an adult at Princeton. It was traumatic. Deeply traumatic. It took him several years to overcome it, but he did, and he learned to deal with his epilepsy. He learned to recognize when an attack was imminent so that he could absent himself from the public stage. It gives me greater admiration for him even than I had before to understand how he overcame the disability it represented. In his time, it was thought to be the result of demonic possession.
Do you think it helped shape his character?
Oh, absolutely. It made him tougher than he would have been otherwise. It also gave him an appreciation for intellectual freedom I think he wouldn't have had otherwise, because he had to live with this stereotype that epilepsy was the product of sin. And he knew it wasn't true, and it made him determined that nobody should have to believe things they knew weren't true.
Did that lead into his great defense for the freedom of religion?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced there's a connection. He and Jefferson both saw religious freedom and intellectual freedom on a spectrum. And when Madison managed to get through the Virginia statute for religious freedom that Jefferson had authored, he wrote to Jefferson, "We have defeated forever the idea that one can impose intellectual servitude on another."
And that helps when it comes time to write the Bill of Rights and that First Amendment.
Yes, but the Bill of Rights is interesting because Madison didn't think it was necessary. He thought that the Constitution hadn't given away any of those rights on the part of the people. But when it came time to write them, yes, indeed, what later became the First Amendment was important to him.
And he defended the Baptists, too. I mean, that's where he first has his sense of religious freedom. Right?
Exactly. The Baptists were being persecuted, jailed. Soldiers would ride among crowds listening to a sermon and knock people over and beat the slaves who were listening, and Madison was appalled. He didn't like Baptists too much. He thought they were too emotional. But that didn't matter. They have a right to do what they're doing, and he defended it futilely in the short term, but ultimately quite successfully.
And he went beyond, there was a word tolerance that was often used. He went beyond that. Tell me about that.
Well, when the idea of the Virginia Declaration of Rights was being debated, the notion was that the state would be tolerant of all religions. And Madison saw that as a kind of intellectual insult. Nobody has the right to grant tolerance. No one has the authority to tolerate what you or I think. You and I have the fundamental right to think what seems right to us. So he took that word out, and it became described as a fundamental right on the part of each of us to be able to think and believe as we choose.
Another example of why he's helped shape the nation as it is today. Thank you very much. We'll be back with another lesson after this.